bed in my pajamas, looking at Facebook on my phone like our students do. And I got a message from my neighbor saying, Omelet didn't come home last night. Omelet's her black chicken. And she lets them run around, and Omelet had not returned. Could you please check to see if Omelet's in your garage? Because Omelet was showing interest in my garage. And I said, and she said, could you do it tomorrow morning? I wasn't going to wait until tomorrow morning. I said, I'm on the case, right? So I put on my robe, and I got the flashlight, and I'm going out and I'm hunting for Omelet. My husband is too. Omelet, Omelet, no Omelet. We're out there. Omelet, finally couldn't find Omelet, went back hoping that nothing bad happened to Omelet. Turned out the next day, Omelet was discovered, no problem. She was roosting in our lilies of the valleys, and actually even laying eggs in there too. So happy end to the story, but then I realized, oops, it is hard to find a black chicken in the dark. It is really hard to find a black chicken in the dark, but it's even harder if you don't know what a chicken looks like. And so now when I introduce my students to these are the relationships between the ideas, I think what I'm doing is I'm showing them what a chicken looks like. Sometimes they're going to have to hunt for it in the dark. They're going to read things that are poorly written, badly structured, long, complicated material, but they'll at least know what they're looking for. So, maybe the thing to do right now is just to ask yourself, what chickens look like in your area? What kind of arguments do you think students will need to see, even when they're hard to see? So the goal is, once students have a visual representation of argument structure, they'll get the schema. They'll have a sense for how arguments work. Then they can use that to understand them, to evaluate them, and to construct them. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about each of these things, just so you can see how it might play out. Not necessarily will play out in your area, but give you some ideas, something to think about, right? Something to sink your teeth into. For understanding arguments, here is what I have my students do. Now I have my students read text. Increasingly, and when I say this is, what I have my students do, it's not as though this is a gospel in any way. It's just, this is what I have found to be useful. I found it, and this is relatively new, useful to try to help students to internalize certain questions when they read. The first question I want them to identify is, what's the main point? Like, what's the conclusion? And then, as they read everything else, I want them to actively engage by asking themselves, is this important? And if so, how does it work with what's gone before? And then maybe partly, what can I expect to come next? But that's a more advanced thing. So here's an argument. It's a little more advanced, at least longer than the ones we've seen before. Here would be how it would be mapped. So I just show this to you to demonstrate that, even though there are only so many primitive relationships. This would be a primitive relationship, this would be a primitive relationship, this would be one, this would be one. Those particular chickens can be put together in a whole, in a different way to represent really literally any argument. It's an expressively complete system. I'm going to pause here. What do you have? Because I know this is, I'm fire hosing right now. Yeah.
Earlier we mentioned that about the writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, when I experienced this argument mapping, just learning how to identify the conclusion of a paragraph taught me how to write a paragraph with only one conclusion.
Yes.
So it was a good chicken identifier.
Yes, it is. I give my students really teeny-weeny writing assignments, which is one of the things that I'm maybe most excited about, because it's made assessment a lot easier. I don't kill myself evaluating student writing in this class. I give short assignments that ask them to do specific things, and they sometimes can and they sometimes can't. And at first I was really self-conscious about it, thinking this is a complete waste of their time and it's just making me feel good because I'm assigning writing. Right? Routinely in my evaluations, I get students saying how helpful it was, which is nice. It's nice to hear. Just little teeny assignments.
I can comment.
Yeah?
I remember getting those assignments and at first being like, what the heck?
Mm-hmm.
Because they were so small.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was one of those students that was like, wow, this really works.
Yeah.
It really
This is,
worked for me.
by the way, this is Corey Rush. He's a former student of mine, graduate from here, who just got his master's in education, right? And he wrote a master's thesis on critical thinking and pedagogy. So he's kind of joined the group now. Welcome aboard, Corey. Here is a trick that I have found useful, particularly in sort of excavating assumptions, the warrant or the assumptions. It's the puzzle piece test. What I'll do is I will draw this on the board, and I'll ask my students to visualize what the bottom shape will look like. And then I have them describe it. And sure enough, they all come up with something like this. And then I'll ask them, great, what happened to the circle part? And I'll say, well, that's where they combine. That's exactly right. Often, in fact, I think the vast majority of the time, when two ideas combine, they will combine in virtue of having something in common. But that will not show up in the resulting conclusion. Instead, the only ideas that will be visible in the resulting conclusions will be like the leftover bits, I call them. And this is particularly useful for helping them to retrofit missing conclusions, missing premises. So for instance, well, I changed this recently. Here, I might have my students, this is part of like, what might people say next? If they realize that the author is saying this and this, I'll say, how are they related to each other? They always need to figure that out. Well, they're added, they're combined like this, great. What might follow from this? So I have them think, well, what's in common? Well, students are in common, good. So that's the circle bit. That's not going to show up at the conclusion. And if you think they think that I'm insulting their intelligence when I do this, maybe they do, but they eat it up, right? They like it. They don't act like their intelligence is being insulted. So what's left over here is only, so that what's in common is not students have a good chance of succeeding. That's here and that's here. What's left over is not all. What's left over is should go to college. So when you put those together, you just get not all students should go to college. So they can figure out what follows. And more importantly, they can figure out what's being taken for granted. So let's just try this here. It's the same thing again, except instead, imagine that this is given and this is given, but this is not given. So what does this have to look like? Well, what's in common is the square bit, so that's not going to be here. What's left over is the round bit and the triangle bit. So that's going to make this up, and order matters. It's going to be the round bit first, and then the triangle bit. This corresponds to an if-then sentence. So, let's just play. Most colleges focus on providing a broad education in the liberal arts. Vocational training isn't best offered by colleges. What's in common here? What are they both talking about? Colleges, good. So that idea will not appear here. Instead, we're going to make an if-then sentence where the leftover parts come from here, for the if and the then comes from here. And I tell my students to not worry about grammar at first. Just mechanically do this. I mean, the downside is it's mechanical. The great thing is it's mechanical. So this is what you have. If focus on providing a broad education in the liberal arts, then vocational training isn't best offered by. Okay, now make it grammatical. If an institution focuses on providing a broad education in the liberal arts, then vocational training isn't best offered by that institution. Great. Now don't sound like a robot. Vocational training isn't best offered by institutions that focus on providing a broad education in the liberal arts. That's a reasonably effective way. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but at worst I would say at least 90. At helping people to find this thing. Because often, and I've read lots of critical thinking textbooks, usually the way this is, when they talk about coming up with missing premises or missing assumptions, the standard advice is, what is the author assuming here? Horrible advice. Because students will say things like, oh, I don't know, the author is assuming that people think liberal arts is good. The author is assuming that colleges exist. All of these things are things that the author is assuming, but they aren't the things that the author is assuming when they go from here to here. So just in terms of like Tupperware, I mean, seriously, try this. I think it works. I really think it works. So that's understanding, and that's just a really quick, that's just like a, here's some things you might want to try. What about evaluating? And again, this is not gospel, this is just what I do, just to sort of show what maybe can be done. And you will come up with other things, which is why you're in this room, right? You're in this room because we want you to come up with other things that fit your disciplines that you can share. But for me, I want my students to answer 2 questions about premises, just 2. I try to keep it little. Is it true? And could someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion think that it's true? Right. This controls for circular arguments, obviously. I mean, it's pretty primitive. I'm not getting into anything deep in terms of information literacy. That can come later, and maybe if I had extra time, I would do that. Inferences, students have trouble with. Students have a tendency to think, and you might have noticed this, at least my students do, and I think my students are pretty representative, that if the premise is false, the inference has to be bad. And I think this is very much related to a tenuous or maybe even non-existent grasp on argument schema. Because if they see claims, they tend not to see inferences at all. And if you don't see inferences, it's hard to evaluate them. So let's just say that I have an argument like, oh, I don't know. Todd, can I use you as an example?
Sure.
Okay. Todd Huspenny is from Mars and still has family there, okay? Therefore, there's intelligent life on other planets. I might use that example. And I'll ask students, what do you think about that inference? They'll say bad. I'll say why? They'll say, because Todd Huspenny isn't from Mars. And I'll say, I know.
Or isn't intelligent.
Isn't intelligent.
I like that one better.
So, I'll say I know that, but if it were true, would this follow? And they'll say no, and I'll say why, and they'll say because it isn't true, and I'll say I know. But if you believed it, would this follow? What do you suppose they'll say? I don't believe it, right? So, I invented the Bob method, and this is another thing that can help. I was drawn to this in extremity in my office by a student. I finally said, okay, I'm either going to physically break something or come up with a good idea. I said, okay, look, I know you don't believe it. I don't believe it either. But Bob does believe it. Bob is a perfectly gullible, perfectly rational person. So Bob believes anything you tell him, but he reasons well. Got it? Got it. Great. We tell Bob. Todd Huspenny is from Mars, and he still has family there. How likely is Bob going to be to believe that there's intelligent life on other planets? And the student said, oh, yes. So now I give them that. What that does is it severs the connection, right, between their own assumption, their own tendency to like this, and their tendency to like this. Also, because students have an increasingly overt desire to learn how to empathize, I can frame it in that way too. I can say, pretend that, empathize with this person who believes that. All I have my students look at are premises and inferences. That's because, another way to evaluate inferences, and this is often better, is to have students figure out what the missing premise is maybe using that puzzle piece thing, and evaluate that. That's a really common way to do it, and it's very, very powerful. Because then it's a little bit easier to articulate why there's something wrong with the inference. If this is all students have, the only way they can articulate that is to say, well, Bob might believe the thing at the top and not believe the thing at the bottom, which is not instructive to people who don't know the Bob method. But if you say, look, this inference requires this assumption, and that assumption is false, bang, right? That is super powerful. So when I think about, if we collectively were to produce like little modules, that I think might be an interesting module. How to come up with missing premises and assess those premises in order to evaluate an argument across multiple disciplines. And what does that look like? I try to break my students from the habit of going after things like this. I tell my students that, and this is partly grasping the schema, this all has to do with understanding how arguments work. Say, the argument just wants us to accept this. So if we don't accept it, it's like a legitimate move to say humbug, right? But the argument isn't expecting us to accept this. The argument wants us to be convinced of this. So it's an illegitimate move to say humbug to this. I can't say I don't accept it. I need to say I'm not convinced of it. So we need to look at the reasons. And then I really want my students to understand why all of this matters and why it doesn't matter. That you should be persuaded by good arguments, but bad arguments tell us nothing. By the way, just a fun fact, maybe? My students, at least, have much more trouble with this than this. It's not that they think that bad arguments tell us something that they don't. They think that arguments don't tell us anything good or bad. So that they want, it's almost like they want to keep some students want to keep a firewall between their own belief and their evaluation of the reasoning. So I think that we as an institution might want to examine and just see, maybe it's just in my courses, but I would be really curious to see if you choose to explore this, what you find there. So that's evaluating. Now constructing, there's a few different ways. One way, and I'm working, Cade Spalding, there you are. We're working with this in COM 101. One thing that we can do, has this been used yet, Cade? This is for the persuasive speech?
Yeah, it
Oh.
has.
Did it work?
Well, Jasper used it last semester, and he found a lot of really good example students were really able to make some improvements. We haven't gone to that point yet with this semester, so
Okay,
we
good.
have yet to find out.
I'm really curious, yeah. One idea was that maybe we could have just a template. And this is a template for means ends reasoning. And the idea would be that hopefully, not whatever this is, in addition to filling these things in, students would learn a little bit about what means ends reasoning is. It's, you know, if you want to make a recommendation, you have to talk about what you want to achieve and the fact that your recommendation will give you what you want to achieve. Those are not optional. But then there's other things you might say. You might try to convince people that what you want is desirable, or that the recommended course of action is going to be effective, or that this is a better way to get what you want than other ways. This is something that people sometimes overlook. There's like a rush to the first idea. And then some comparative facts. If we don't want to use a template, and I use templates, this is why my writing assignments are so short. I have ever-expanding templates. Right? And I ask students then to write the arguments in addition to filling out the templates. When I talk to my students about, when I talk to myself about how to write arguments, this is kind of how I talk to myself. First, I want to think of what the question is. What are some answers? What are some answers that I like best? That's going to be the conclusion. It's 3. That corresponds to this. Then, what's a reason to believe that? Modify it if you need to. Is that okay? Will your audience believe it? If not, tell them something to believe it. Is the inference okay? If it's not, fill it in. And is there some other kind of thing that people might be thinking? That would be over there. So this is just an example of how specific questions, because I'm starting to think in my own teaching that asking the same questions over and over again is really useful for students. And then writing it. The nice thing about having students, having my students at least, map an argument first, is that then they can write it on the basis of the map and ask questions that couldn't occur to them otherwise. Like, of these ideas, which should they say first? And then what should they say? And how can they help the reader to understand the connections there? By the way, there are some online resources that we've linked to in D2L. Timo, who's in charge of rationale, will kill me for not demonstrating it, but I don't want to take the time right now. I might make a little video or something to demonstrate this. It's really useful. This is another site that talks about arguments that have been mapped. There's resources out there. We're not the only place that's doing it, but I think we are the only place that's doing this intentionally, and we can do it better. So, group discussion too. Do you want to do this? Now this, I realize you might not be able to really answer terribly well. We have, let me see, how am I doing for time? About perfect.
That's a little fast in
It's a little
case you're
fast.
keeping score at home, but.
Yeah, no, we're pretty much right on mark.
Okay.
What we've scheduled for is maybe 15 minutes talking about how you think this might work. And that might not be fair right now because you've just seen it really quickly. And then we're going to talk about some wrap-up stuff. Todd will introduce you to maybe what the next steps will be, right? So, yes.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Hmm?
Sorry, I'm way back here.
No, it's
so I
okay.
don't
No,
know.
that's right. Yeah, yes, yes.
Have you ever used, I think the university has a license for Lucidchart.
I've looked at Lucidchart.
I have my students do some argument mapping on Lucidchart.
Do you?
Quite attractive.
The problem that I've, and
Play with it a little
you
bit.
might want to help me. When I looked at Lucidchart, I couldn't figure out a way to have ideas added together. Do they do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I had them, we were doing the really basic, okay,
Yeah.
this is your evidence and this is your claim, what logic
Right,
ties them together.
yeah,
And is it something universal?
exactly. And so for small arguments like that, Lucidchart works.
Yeah, you start kind of low and then.
Yep, for arguments that have ideas that need to be added together or combined in that way, tools other than rationale, I've seen haven't worked as well. But that's, I'm gonna take a look at that. Gonna make a note. Yes?
Just a small point, when you were talking about the premise versus claim, and trying to sort of work back up from that, and the whole, the Bob example, I feel sorry for Bob. But that actually reminded me of what I did last week in class when students were asking about the Maya and human sacrifice. And the way I approached it, I don't think I was consciously thinking of this, but this would actually work very well with that, because I was trying to get them to figure out what the premise is, and that would allow you to accept that as a logical, rational response to the world.
Right.
And if you truly believe that the sun will not come up, right, because the sun is fighting against the Lord of the Underworld, and he needs
Absolutely.
blood, right, so that was what I was trying to do. This is a way of kind of formalizing that. perhaps.
Absolutely, and I think that's really powerful. I like to tell my students that if you criticize someone's premise, you're saying that they're mistaken. If you criticize their inference, you're saying they're irrational. That's a stronger thing. So you can say of someone that they're reasoning fine, they're just mistaken about the Lord of the Underworld. Yeah, yes?
My name is Bob, by the way.
Hi, Bob.
But in biology, we're constantly subject to change in interpretation of information, and it's all based upon this person's assembly of all these assumptions and beliefs that lead up to the conclusion that their research is best. And that's what it kind of boils down to. And every day you're getting bombarded with new research that says mine is the best and here are my reasons.
Right.
And it becomes very overwhelming for students that are coming from that fact-based
Right.
schema to
Right.
try and understand that you have to look much deeper than just the conclusion to understand what's there.
Right.
And a lot of times there's good information that's being ignored along the way, and there's faulty assumptions or information that are being, accept it as dogma so that it can get you to another point that they're not connected by because and therefore as often
Right,
as they like.
right, because they tend to be looking at facts, right, rather than the schema. By the way, just thinking in terms of science, I was talking to someone from a social science, and this person was saying that what was challenging for him was to help students to see that interpretations or predictions come from a theory applied to data, right? And so you can take a look at those separately. And if you apply different theory to the same data, you're gonna come up with different predictions. Or different data to the same theory, you're gonna come up with different predictions. And if you apply this theory to this data and the prediction doesn't match what's going on, something's gotta give. And someone who wrote in the spring spoke about that quite eloquently, that students had difficulty realizing that something has to give and trying to decide what's that going to be. Is it going to be, I was wrong about the starting conditions? Or is it going to be basically, I'm just mistaken about how things really work and I'm using the wrong theory? Yeah, so I think that would be one place it could show up. Yes?
Well, I think kind of like following up on that theory is that, I mean, we have a lot of different models.
Mm-hmm.
And
Ah.
I'm a chemist, so we have in a lot of different times, different models are the better models to use. Like if you can get away with a simple model, then why use something more complicated? But that there are times that you have to use a more complicated model to get the, what we observe.
Yeah.
Have it consistent with,
Yeah.
with observations. I think like that's a hard thing, like, because this breaks down some of the time, well, then we should throw it out. But really, we shouldn't throw it out. We should use it, but know when it's useful.
Right, it's a tool.
Right.
Yeah, right. What else? Yes?
I think one thing that helps in psychology is, first of all, most students walk in thinking they're a psychologist to start with. You know, their daily background, everything else, and your model can set up their very facts, this is the facts, and so you throw a research example out there, and then break the research example apart like you were just saying, and they'll find out they don't get the conclusion they think.
Right,
And quite often in psychology, what you think is going to happen in common sense isn't what happens.
right,
And so that forces them to decide, okay, what went wrong? Well,
Right.
the original reasoning.
right, good, yes. And by the way, one of the reasons that, in addition to time, that we decided against having little arguments, it's harder than it looks. It is harder than it looks. And as a matter of fact, I mean, Vera, you've done it for your classes, right? But you do understand things better after you do it, don't you?
Well, usually coaching with students, like we did a simple argument in French though, so they had their challenges, but the idea was the reading is important for learning. So that was our main premise, but then I said, you have to give me 2 arguments that confirm it and 1 that contradicts it. Ooh, that was difficult. And then we started adding, we ended up having 17 arguments. And when we did the discussion, for 45 minutes they were speaking in French, and I don't know if that tells you anything. For me, it was an ecstatic moment. My students are speaking in French and they know what to say to each other. So I wanted to repeat that as often as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And the nice thing about having something that is visual is you can point to it. Rationale, the link that I didn't show you, is part of a broader group of software, dyad of software. There's another thing called Decisive, which can be used to run meetings. How about that? And some of the work in argument mapping has been done in meeting facilitation. So instead of just taking minutes, what you do is you put like a problem statement on the board, and then as people give suggestions, you show how those are related, and if someone gives an objection to a suggestion, you show how that's related. And I'm really interested in exploring that. You know, I think that could be remarkably useful, because if nothing else, it prevents people from going back to the same points over and over again. You can point to it and say, is this it? You know? So having a visual representation on a common display is useful. I know we're a little bit ahead of time, but Todd, maybe now would be a good time?
Sure, you want to move to the,
I think so, just
Okay.
because I don't want you to feel
Sure.
rushed.
no, sounds good. So, probably the most important, as I get to the wrap up here, the most important thing to mention is, especially if we end a little bit early, there's a lot of food left. While there isn't a lot of coffee, and I apologize on that. I think there's decaf if you're into that, but that may be gone as well. But please, stay, eat. We don't need to vacate the room. Take and eat. Any of those, please, because the food is here. In terms of where we're going next, we tried to kind of timeline this out in terms of what we wanted to achieve institutionally. And basically, whatever the conclusion of this work will be essentially presented in a report that is basically due 1.5 years from now. But what we wanted to do was to pace out our work initially with our faculty exploration groups on a monthly basis, given that we're busy and have a lot of things going on. We received a lot of feedback with respect to this particular meeting. There are about 20 colleagues, the ones who actually couldn't make it today because they were ill or had another thing come up, plus the dozen or so who informed us they wanted to be here, but this was not a good time. So we have a lot of colleagues who aren't here today, and a lot of suggestions that, you know, moving it toward the regular work day where we feed you lunch is preferable, so we're going to try that at least for the remaining 2 meetings in this semester. So we've scheduled essentially, and I'll mail this email out to everybody who's communicated with me, but basically noon on Friday, October 21st, we'll figure out the room. We'll have you essentially register, decide what you want for lunch from the menu. And the second day is noon on essentially Friday, November 18th. What we're attempting to accomplish then at each of those next meetings, and I'll bop back to D2L here in a second, but is basically to continue the discussion at our October meeting of argument mapping in a little bit more detail. You've gotten a little bit of a taste of it here. And look to form essentially smaller groups based upon disciplinary interest, based upon really, I guess, your interest in terms of the types of things, questions, sharing ideas, creating and sharing materials, that type of thing. But the idea is, at least as we kind of developed it, is that this particular large FEG, the big FEG, will be composed and comprised at some point of smaller FEGs where you break off by discipline or interest. So we'll try to help facilitate that. In the November meeting, a little bit more on argument mapping in terms of a tutorial and practice, and then a discussion as to what argument mapping may provide or how it may work within your discipline. The main connecting resource to colleagues who are able to come to these meetings and shift in and out of attendance and all of that is we've set up a D2L site. Every one of you who registered for this, I've put into and entered into the D2L site. I think it's the Faculty Exploration Group site on D2L. You got to make sure to go in and choose your role within D2L. You're enrolled, at least at this point, in the student capacity. We may seek to change that and make all of ourselves instructors, but right now
ongoing.
It's ongoing. Yep, and yep. If you log into D2L, and if you have any issues connecting, let me know. I want to make sure that I've got you in there. Basically, we've got a lot of different critical thinking, essentially resources that DONA has provided. This particular PowerPoint will be there as well, and we should mention that we've had this videotaped. I suppose we could have let you know that at the beginning, but there you go, and that tape, or at least some sort of summary of it, should be there as well. But basically, that's the resources and the timeline for what we want to do this semester. We see this continuing on, at least with monthly meetings, into the spring, where essentially we want to develop a little bit more how this approach may work and in what ways in particular disciplines. Okay, so that's kind of our goal. Lastly, and then I will be quiet, there are little 3x5 or whatever the dimension is here, cards in front of you. We'd like feedback from you if you'd take a moment simply to answer the question, and sorry it's on the bottom there, but does argument mapping look like it may assist you in teaching critical thinking to your students? And I realize that can be a yes or no question. What we really want, depending upon whether it's yes or no, if so, how so? If not, why not? So in other words, and I'll read that again to you if you can't see it, does argument mapping look like it may assist you in teaching critical thinking to your students? So does it look like it might be a helpful approach? And then the more meaty part, if so, how so? If not, why not? And so please take whatever time you desire on that. Please do avail yourself of the food, and we didn't want to take a lot of time in terms of having people introduce themselves to fellow colleagues here, but take this opportunity to introduce yourself to a colleague that maybe you don't know from across campus. So, anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And if I could add to, this is not one of the official questions, but it occurs to me, if you could also let us know, if there is anything that might assist you, that you might find particularly useful, please let us know that. So if you're interested in doing that, let us know what might assist you most, because that will help us to prioritize our next steps.
Thank you all.
Thank you.